You tuned into PBAFM on 89.7 with Bianca Vlahos, and I'd like to welcome my guest on the line, Deirdre Gelderman, founder of Body Language Australia. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Bianca.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Now, this topic is one that I'm sure most of us are so interested in because, as we know, most of how we communicate is with our body. Is it only 10 to 15% of our words and the rest is our body?
Yeah, anywhere between 60 and 90% of communication happens with the body. Two people having a normal conversation in 30 minutes will exchange over 800 non-verbal signals.
Oh, interesting. Now, I was looking at your website and you talk a lot about a lot of different things, but we'll start off with the eyebrows. So eyebrows are so important when we're communicating with someone.
Yeah, eyebrows, when you lift your eyebrows up, it says something important's happening. So if you're a teacher, for example, and you want to highlight a point non-verbally, lift your eyebrows up and at some level the students will understand that this point is important. And then from the other perspective, if you're listening to someone and you want to honour them and pay attention without interrupting them and saying, hey, I am listening and I understand you, lift your eyebrows up. That expresses, that shows that you're showing interest.
And I understand that it's important when we talk to people, especially in interviews, to look at them front on and get direct eye contact.
There is this thing called fronting, and fronting means top, torso and toes all pointing at the most important thing. And that if you're talking to someone, that would be that other person. And if you go to a networking event or a party or something like that, you'll see someone's top and torso may be pointing at the other person, but their toes will be pointing at the alcohol, the bar, or at the food table, or at the toilets, or even at the exit door. And so that where the toes are pointing shows you what they really think is important. So yeah, should really look at someone straight on and also front them with your body.
So a lot of these points that we're noticing it unconsciously, not consciously, which is more powerful.
Yep. And it's bodies talking to bodies, and we, body language is a lot more important to us back in caveman days, and the thing that we all notice about someone, the first thing we notice about someone when we meet them is their hands, and that goes back to caveman days with respect to if you couldn't see what that other person, if you couldn't see their hands, you didn't know whether they had a spear or a club or a rock, hidden behind their back. So that was the sign of openness was hands. And a lot of our body language, we don't see or are not aware of consciously, but at some unconscious level, we still notice it, and it still drives how we behave and respond to other people.
And I like the way you talk about expressive hands, and we can't overuse them, and you call them jazz hands.
That's me, jazz hands. Yeah, I
and me.
Yeah, and if you look at the TED Talks, and they looked at the TED Talks that were, in which there was a deal actually done, and the sharks. Oh, sorry, I'm talking about Shark Tank. My apologies. You look at the Shark Tanks where deals were actually done and the sharks bought something versus the when there were no deals done.
Yeah.
And also at TED Talks, the people that were most successful in both those environments, the TED Talks went viral, those guys had something like 2 or 3 times as many hand movements as the TED Talks that didn't go viral on the Shark Tank guys and gals that weren't successful. So expressive hands, yeah.
Right. And also no hands at all, that's a problem.
Not hands at all is really important, Bianca. They did studies with juries and they asked juries, quite a number of juries over quite a number of years and quite a few studies, what made them believe or more likely to believe that a defendant was innocent or guilty. Well, if the defendant had his or her hands under the table, that made the juries believe they were more likely to be guilty. So when you're meeting someone for the first time, visible hands and then animate your hands. If you're not comfortable animating them, find a way to animate your hands to talk with other people. And it's really important if you're trying to sell yourself, like as in if you're a salesperson or if you're trying to sell a concept or an idea. And when I'm talking about selling a concept or an idea, I'm also talking about as a teacher, So, use your hands.
Mm. And some other common traits of successful contestants on TV shows or winners were often smiling, and that was very important.
Yeah, smiling is the second most important thing after visible hands. And again, if you go back to caveman days, we actually make 7 micro-expressions. So micro-expressions are expressions that happen on our face. They're involuntary. We typically can't control them unless we've done a lot of practice, and they happen in times of intense emotion. And there are 7 of them, and one of them is happiness and the smile and the genuine smile. And you can pick a smile from 250 to 300 metres away. You can pick a smile and tell whether someone's smiling genuinely or whether it's a fake smile. So, again, it goes back, decades, eons.
And one thing that I'm sure a lot of us have experienced is personal space and people coming too close or standing too far back. That's also something that people experience.
Exactly, and the study of that is called, proxemics, and we have 4 zones all the way from the intimate zone, which is up to about 18 to 38 inches, a foot and a half away from our bodies, 30 to 40 centimetres if you want to go in the centimetre thing, to the public space, which is 10, 15 feet away. So you don't want to invade someone's personal space inadvertently. But the interesting thing is, if you look at people with charisma, the charismatic people do invade other people's personal space, and I should put italics around the word invade. So what they do is, when they're listening to someone, they will either lean in and raise their eyebrows when that other person's saying something interesting, and then lean back. So that leaning in goes into their personal space in a very gentle way and makes them makes the person that is doing the talking feel charismatic. And also, a charismatic person will lightly or gently touch a person on their hand or their forearm. And so there's some of the real characteristics of charisma and how they tie into proxemics.
That's interesting. And why is a handshake so important? And I understand oxytocin is in the mix here.
Yeah, and I think we've got the classic example, haven't we? Mr. Trump, and his handshake has been shown all over TV for the last 6 months. So a handshake, a human touch releases oxytocin. Oxytocin has 2 nicknames. It's called the hormone of connection, and it's also called the cuddle hormone. And so when we shake someone's hand, we release oxytocin. Now, the amount of oxytocin that's released in a handshake is equivalent to the amount of rapport building that occurs in a 30-minute conversation. So a handshake, builds 30 minutes of connection. And a handshake, the question becomes, if you use a double-clasped handshake like Trump does that double the oxytocin? Yes, it does. But then the downside of that is, my hand's being grabbed on both sides by someone. That's really uncomfortable. So there's a big trade-off with that. And interesting, Bianca, the other thing that causes the release of oxytocin is when you look someone in the eye. And this can be done on Skype or on Zoom or on any of the net meetings as well. So if you want, in a meeting on Skype, and a lot of people have business meetings and that sort of thing now, if you want to build connection really quickly on a Skype call, then have visible hands, because most of us don't have our hands visible on Skype calls, and look the other person in the eye to cause oxytocin release, and you'll build connection and rapport so much more quickly.
Makes sense. So with regards to Trump, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm seeing quite aggression when he shakes the person's hand. He seems to pull it towards him too, as if to say, I'm the boss.
Yeah, he does 2 things. You're 100% correct. He's pulling the hand towards them, saying, I'm the boss. And he also flips their hand in a lot of cases. So the hand on top is the more powerful hand. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, it's psychological. If you're the person with the hand that's underneath and your hand is being flipped over, then you feel intimidated. And the second thing a flipped over hand does, if you're the person underneath, it exposes your wrist, and it puts your wrist up. And that is a very weakened position because the wrist, as you know, is a very vulnerable area of the body. So, people like Trump doing what they're doing can overdo it and actually overplay their hand, no pun intended, and destroy all the goodwill that they could have built up by doing it, nicely.
And I think we've all experienced the limp one, the limp handshake.
The limp hand is just as bad as the guy that's trying to, got the death grip on your hand, or the guy or gal that flips your hand up.
Which one is worse, the limp one or the power squeeze?
It really comes down to personal opinion. If you touch someone's a handshake builds trust and rapport and connection because it allows you to judge their character and feel how they are. And if you're feeling a limp, floppy hand, you're probably thinking that person has a limp, floppy personality as well.
And so, would you just briefly mention the double clasp handshake? Now, is that when you shake the hand, but then you touch the top of their hand with your other hand?
Well, really, if someone else puts their hand out, you would grab their hand with your right hand like you normally would, and then you get your left hand and you put it on top of their hand, so it's almost like a triple-decker. So your hand, their hand, and then your hand. So their hand is being sandwiched between both your hands.
Oh, because I thought that was like an endearing thing to sort of double touch.
It's supposed to be, but then it can also be very intimidating if it's being done to you. So if you know the person well, it's totally cool. But then if you don't know the person well, it's a little bit overbearing. Yeah,
I could see how that would be interpreted that way. And what about, this is an interesting one, liars? How can we tell if someone's lying?
Well, there's a lot of fallacies about lying, and to detect lies, there's actually a 7-step process or a 7-step system. But, that's just too long. Let's not go there. But let's look at some of the common things that indicate that someone's lying. So for the first thing you need to do is look at their normal behaviour. So let's say, for example, that a person's foot or both feet when you're doing an interview are perfectly still, they're not moving at all. And let's assume you then ask them a question and all of a sudden one of the feet starts to tap. Well, that's a change in baseline behaviour. So that is what we call a red flag. So again, let's assume that someone is sitting there and they're nice and still, and you ask them a question, all of a sudden they start to play with an earring or a tie or twiddle their hair. That's a deviation from baseline behaviour. That's a red flag. When you see 3 red flags, that's called a cluster. And when you have a cluster, you've got a fairly solid idea that there's something going on and that they're possibly lying. So then you start to ask, more in-depth questions. Does that help?
Yes, indeed it does. Thank you.
So all this stuff about someone scratching their nose. Look, Clinton, when he was talking about marijuana smoking, his blink rate went up 4 times. So increased blink rate, there's a change in baseline behaviour. When he was asked about Lewinsky, I can't remember the number of times he touched his nose, but it went up astronomically. Okay. But then, if it's pollen season, and you ask someone, and you're having a talk to someone, they could be scratching their nose all the time. But if they're scratching their nose all the time, that's not a change in baseline behaviour. It's just when it increases that it is. So any change of baseline behaviour is a red flag, and then you should look out.
Now, I did notice, I was looking at a few prominent people, and Oprah Winfrey, I've noticed she always puts her hands up when she greets someone. She sort of puts both hands up to grab their hands, and I think that's amazing. It creates that safe space and saying, look, I want to connect with you. We're on an even keel here. I think that's fantastic. Yep,
I agree 100%. And it's, again, she's got charisma. She's obviously learnt body language, and she's very endearing to people.
Now, the steeple, it's titled Steeple, and lecturers, politicians and executives use this hand gesture, if someone hasn't heard of it, to really make their point, and it's where the tips of their fingers touch, but the palms are separated, and I have seen Trump sitting like that with the hands sort of like in a triangle.
It's a very subtle power move, I guess, and it shows that you're thinking, and it shows that you're credible, and it shows that you're, quietly powerful. So, the steeple is a form of quiet power. And if you need time to think, if someone's asked you a question during an interview or whatever, and you need time to think, if you steeple, then you'll automatically be given a little thinking leeway. They won't push you for an answer as quickly because that hand gesture or hand movement indicates that you're thinking.
What about, I came across power priming, and this is to display confidence and to be perceived as upbeat and positive, which is where we're thinking of a past success that fills us with a great deal of confidence, and then that comes out through our body. So let's say going into an interview to recall a genuine positive emotion where you were successful, and then that comes out through your body.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and that can be even made much more simply now. So there were some studies done by a lady called Amy Cuddy, and there's been lots of others as well, and they got people to power pose. So power posing is standing like Superman or Wonder Woman. In other words, you're occupying space, taking up space, claiming territory. And if you do that for 2 minutes, now I'll give you an example. They did a Harvard study, and they taught, these people were sitting for mock interviews. They didn't know they were mock interviews, but they were mock interviews. And they asked, half the group was told to power pose before the mock interview, and the other half of the group were not told anything like this at all. The group that went in and power posed, or when it went power posed first for 2 minutes, and then went in and just did a normal interview, their hireability, and their whole, everything that was assessed by the interviewers was higher than the ones that hadn't power posed. So, A, they felt better, therefore they performed better, and B, the interviews perceived them as being more efficient and better and everything else.
Now, I just want to talk a little bit before we finish about interviews, because we all go for interviews, and that's probably the most stressful thing. My gosh! Yep. So how do we deal with that?
Obviously, power pose. So power pose for 2 minutes. I mean, if let's assume that you're in a reception area and there's 30 other people there going to the interviews, and that sometimes happens, and you can't go to the bathroom and power pose or something like that. What you can do is get an old broadsheet newspaper, the old ones like the Sydney Morning Herald, and just sit on your chair and hold that open. That gives you a more powerful position. There's actually been work done on that. So power pose, and then when you walk into the interview, a number of things. Visible hands, smile, which we've been through, and then the third thing is nodding your head. And again, they did some studies on Shark Tank with respect to who won and who didn't, and the head nod was very typical. Wow. Now, nod your head in acknowledgement of the people that are interviewing you. Okay.
And also, it's probably better to stand up in the waiting room than sit down, because you feel more nervous when you sit down, but when you stand up, all the energy's up.
Yeah, and the worst thing to do, and what most people will do, is they'll actually do what's called a low power pose as opposed to a high power pose. Now, a low power pose is minimising the space that you take up and minimising your size. And we all do that probably about 80 times a day when we check our mobile phones. Okay. Now, we hunch our shoulders over, drop our head down, look at near our waist, and that drops all the hormones that make you feel powerful, and that's the worst thing to do before an interview. So I'm going to suggest that anybody that's going for an interview, lock your phone in the boot. Yeah. Don't take it up to the interview with you.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. I came across that one as well. That's a big no-no. People placing their cell phones, their mobile phones in between themselves and the interviewer is just a big,
Oh, that too. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Big no-no. And also, we did sort of touch on it a little bit, but I'll just reiterate that when we stand with our feet close together, we can seem hesitant or unsure of what we're saying. So, again, the power pose to widen our stance, relax our knees and centre our weight in our lower body so we look more solid and confident.
Exactly. You're standing not like a tripod, of course, but like a solid, two-legged base, like a good solid structure. That's how you need to stand. Yep.
And one other thing that some people have a habit of doing is eye rolling, and this is like really bad. They might not realise they're doing it, but it can show frustration and aggression, and it's just a big, key to getting out the door and not getting that job if you're an eye roller.
Absolutely. That's one of the really big turn-offs.
Now, what about our pitch? Because I came across some studies about lowering our vocal pitch in the workplace. The quality of our voice can be a deciding factor in how we're perceived. Is that anything? So there's two things here, I guess. Number one, you're 100% correct with the pitch. A lower pitch in both a man and woman makes you appear more honest, more connectable, more knowledgeable, more authoritative. So, obviously you don't want to lower your pitch below what your natural range is, but if you try and speak on the out breath, just like I'm doing then, that naturally lowers your pitch. So if you tend to have a high pitch, like I sometimes do, when you speak on the out breath and learn to speak more on the out breath, your pitch will naturally drop. So that's number one. And number two, what a lot of people will do is use what's called the question inflection. So, for example, I'd like to earn $35,000. So it's a rising inflection at the end of the tone, or rising inflection at the end of the statement. That's called a question inflection, and that makes you appear uncertain of what you're saying. Whereas if you've got a straight inflection, I'd like to earn $35,000. Now that is the flat. And that has more credibility than a rising inflection. Now, Deirdre, can you just tell the listener a little bit about what you do? You've got some workshops coming up. How can they contact you?
I've got 3 workshops coming up, actually. Thank you for asking. The dates, what are they? They're in October.
Okay.
7 and 21 October in Sydney and Canberra. They're one-day events. They're on a Saturday. And then early in November, we've got a 2-day, much more in-depth, like immersion training in Sydney. If anybody wants to contact me, probably the easiest way to contact me is to go to the website, bodylanguageaustralia.com, and all my contact details are on there.
And I will just make this point, because I did see this on one of your flyers on your website. You've got in the course that we'll learn to discover why women are naturally better at using and reading body language than men. I know I had to say it.
Yeah, you had to bring that up. And look, you're 100% correct. And again, let's look at this from a caveman perspective. So women have 14 to 16 areas of the brain that process body language. Men have 4 to 6. So yes, women are much better at reading body language than men, and there's a physiological reason for that. Now, why might that be? Well, the caveman woman had a lot less ways to protect herself. Wow. If the husband was out playing with the mastodons or whatever and bringing home lunch, and someone strange came round, she had to protect herself and protect the kids and the campfire and the whole deal. And the ones that survived, of course, were better at reading the strange person's body language and therefore surviving. So that's why it's happened. It's just natural, Darwin theory.
Yeah, it makes sense. So fascinating and so logical.
It is. Well, it all goes back to the, we had a superpower back then. And look, babies can read facial expressions from 10 days of age, so they can read our facial expressions. So, but it's sort of trained out of them. Don't listen to your body, start listening to the facts, And
animals too.
Absolutely.
It's incredible.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating.
I mean, when my dog's standing on the other side of the room and I'm chopping vegetables or whatever, and I've literally looked at him, I actually just smiled. I didn't make any noise and the tail went. I thought, that is freaky.
Well, they read body language. They read our body language, and they read each other's body language. Obviously, because they don't have as much verbal communication skills as we do. And yeah, very, very important in animals. Absolutely.
Now, did you previously work as a vet?
Yes, I graduated as a vet in 1977. I love clinical work, so I still do some clinical work occasionally. And I read animals' body language as well as people.
Oh yeah, animals, their intuition is amazing. We can learn so much from them.
Yep, I agree.
It's been great having you on the show. Any last words to our listener?
No. Look, if anybody wants to know any more, just give me a yell. I also work with people one-on-one and hold, small group workshops and whatnot. So I just love, sharing this stuff. It's just so fantastic to help with just life in general.
Yeah, it's so positive, isn't it?
Mm.
Body Language Australia. Deirdre, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure, Bianca. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.